Betrayed, Divorced, Reborn, a man's journey to freedom. Greg Watson believed in routine. Wake up at 6, shower, pour a cup of coffee, kiss his wife goodbye, and endure another grueling day at Randall and Company. Marketing. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was steady, dependable. He always liked that about himself, his reliability. He was the kind of man who kept his promises. The kind of man who worked hard, came home on time, and loved his wife without question. That's why, when he woke up that Monday morning with a dull ache in his lower abdomen, he brushed it off. Probably something he ate. He had never been one to get sick, and besides, the last thing he needed was to fall behind at work. Marissa was already in the bathroom, blow-drying her hair. Through the half-open door, he could see her reflection in the mirror, her sharp, elegant features carefully made up, her silky dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She was stunning, even after 15 years of marriage. "Morning," he murmured, stepping inside. She barely glanced at him. "Morning," she replied coolly, her eyes fixated on her own reflection. Lately, she'd been distant, maybe even cold. She had always been ambitious, throwing herself into her work as a real estate agent, but something had shifted in the last year. The late nights at the office, the urgent weekend showings, the text messages she would tuck her phone away to answer. He told himself he was imagining things. Marissa wasn't the type to cheat. Shaking off the nagging thoughts, he dressed quickly and headed downstairs. His two daughters, Lisa and Ginger, were already at the kitchen table, half awake and picking at their cereal. "Dad, we need money for the school trip," Lisa mumbled. Greg grabbed his wallet and handed her a 20. "What's the trip for again?" Lisa sighed. "Dad, I told you like 5 times. The Science Museum." Greg smirked. "Well, you know me, my brain's not as sharp in the morning." She rolled her eyes but smiled. That was enough to make him feel like things were still normal. Marissa breezed into the kitchen, grabbing her designer handbag off the counter. She was wearing a sleek navy blue dress, the kind she only pulled out when she really wanted to impress someone. "Big day?" Greg asked, sipping his coffee. She smiled, tight-lipped, forced. "Just another showing." Then she was gone. No kiss goodbye, no lingering glance. Just the click of her heels fading down the hallway and the slam of the front door. Greg's stomach twisted. That ache was getting worse. By the time Greg arrived at the office, his discomfort had worsened. It wasn't just a dull ache anymore. It was a sharp, burning pain. Every step he took felt like a fresh sting, like needles scraping against raw skin. He tried to focus on his emails, but within an hour, the pain was unbearable. Sweat beaded at his forehead. His legs bounced under the desk as he debated whether to call a doctor. Then came the moment that sent pure panic through him. When he went to the restroom, what he saw made his blood run cold. A sickly greenish discharge. His hands gripped the sink. He felt dizzy. What the hell was happening? He had never had an STD before. Hell, he had only ever been with one woman. His wife. It hit him all at once. The late nights. The secretive phone calls. The distance. And now this? A knock on the door jolted him back to reality. His boss, Alan Randall, peered in. "Greg, you okay?" Greg straightened, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, just, feeling a little off today." Alan frowned. "You look like hell. Go to a doctor, man. Whatever it is, you don't want it getting worse." Greg nodded, but his mind was already spinning. Minutes later, he was in his car, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. As he pulled into the parking lot of an urgent care clinic, only one thought repeated in his mind. This can't be happening. But it was. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and cheap air freshener. Greg sat stiffly in the exam room, his heart pounding as the doctor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an efficient demeanor, read his test results. "Mr. Watson," she said, looking up from the chart, "your results came back positive for gonorrhea." The words didn't register at first. They hung in the air, foreign and surreal. Greg blinked. That's not possible. The doctor gave him a level look. Have you been sexually active outside your marriage? No, he said instantly. Never. Her expression didn't change. Then you need to have a conversation with your wife. Greg felt like he was sinking. The room was too bright, too sterile, too small. He had been faithful, absolutely faithful, which meant one thing. Marissa had not. The drive to his parents' house felt longer than usual. Greg's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to, his knuckles white against the black leather. He kept replaying the doctor's words in his mind, each syllable slicing into him like a freshly sharpened knife. The word itself was repulsive, like something that belonged in whispered rumors about reckless teenagers, not in his own, seemingly stable, marriage of 16 years. Greg pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, a modest brick house with navy blue shutters, the front porch still adorned with the same wind chimes his mother had hung years ago. The soft, tinkling sound usually brought him comfort. Not today. The second he stepped inside, the familiar scent of butter pecan coffee filled his nose. His father, Dan Watson, stood by the kitchen counter, pouring a fresh cup, his silver hair slightly disheveled from a morning of reading the newspaper. His mother, Evelyn, was at the table, flipping through a stack of mail. Dan looked up. Greg, what are you doing here this early? Greg opened his mouth to speak, but his throat tightened. He wasn't sure how to say it. How do you tell your parents that your wife, the mother of their grandchildren, had betrayed you in the worst possible way? Evelyn, always perceptive, set down the mail and stood. Honey, what's wrong? Greg swallowed hard. He hadn't cried yet, hadn't even allowed himself to process it. But standing in the house where he'd grown up, where love and loyalty were the only things that mattered, it hit him like a punch to the gut. I have gonorrhea, he said finally. The words came out flat, hollow. A thick silence fell over the room. The only sound was the distant ticking of the old wooden clock on the wall. His mother's face paled. Oh, Greg. Dan set his coffee cup down carefully, his expression unreadable. Son, have you been unfaithful? His voice wasn't accusatory, just firm. Greg's head snapped up. No, never. His father studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then I believe you. Greg exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He could feel the weight of his mother's gaze, her hands clasped in front of her mouth as if she were holding back words she didn't want to say. Evelyn broke the silence first. That means Marissa. She stopped herself, as if saying it out loud would make it too real. Greg nodded stiffly. Yeah, it means she cheated on me. His mother sank into the chair. Oh, honey. Dan's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. Have you confronted her? Not yet. I just found out this morning. His father nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. So, what's your next move? Greg ran a hand down his face, the roughness of his unshaven stubble grounding him for a brief second. I don't know. I mean, I know I can't stay with her, but I have to think about Lisa and Ginger. They don't deserve this. Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand in hers, her grip warm and steady. You're right. But Greg, you deserve better than this. She didn't just betray you. She put your health at risk. That's not love. Greg's throat tightened. His mother had always been the emotional one, the nurturer, the one who could take a scraped knee and turn it into a life lesson about resilience. He knew she was right, but knowing it and accepting it were two different things. Dan stood abruptly and disappeared into his office. Greg frowned but didn't ask. When his father returned, he held out a small business card. Gina Hawkins, Dan said. She's a family law attorney, and she's from our church. I've known her for years. She's sharp. If you're serious about this, you should talk to her. Greg stared at the card, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. It felt too soon, too real. But what other choice did he have? After a long pause, he nodded. I'll call her. His father gave him a firm nod, his version of an embrace, while his mother reached out and squeezed his hand once more. We love you, Greg, and no matter what happens, we're here for you. For the first time that day, Greg felt a fraction of relief. But beneath it, the fire of betrayal still burned. And he knew this wasn't over. Greg sat stiffly in the dimly lit office of Gina Hawkins, the soft ticking of a wall clock the only sound between them. He had barely touched the coffee she had offered, his fingers drumming anxiously against the wooden armrest of his chair. Gina, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for being ruthless in court, leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You did the right thing coming to me," she said. "But we need hard evidence before we file anything." Greg swallowed hard, still struggling to wrap his mind around it all. I just can't believe it. Marissa and I." He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "We were solid. Or at least, I thought we were." Gina nodded. "That's the thing about betrayal. It never announces itself." She picked up a sleek black pen and began jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "Let's start with what we do know. She gave you an STD. You've never cheated on her. That means, unless she's been injected by the Holy Spirit himself, she's been unfaithful. The question now is, who and for how long?" Greg clenched his jaw. "I've noticed little things, her being distant, her staying late at work when she doesn't need to, the secret bank account." Gina's pen stopped mid-sentence. "Wait, secret bank account?" Greg nodded. "Yeah, a few weeks ago, I was doing our taxes and noticed money moving in and out of an account I didn't recognize. She's been receiving deposits, big ones, outside of her salary." Gina's brows lifted. "Who's paying her?" "I don't know, but I doubt it's from selling houses." She tapped the end of her pen against her notepad. "This changes things. There's a possibility she's not just cheating. She could be getting financially supported by this person." Greg felt the blood drain from his face. "You mean like a sugar daddy?" "It's possible. Or it could be something more subtle. Maybe it's a coworker paying her off to keep things quiet, a business deal gone wrong, or she's getting paid for something else entirely." Greg exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to think about what that something else might be. "I need to know for sure," he muttered. "I need proof." Gina leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails against the desk in thought. Then, her lips curled into a knowing smirk. "I can recommend a private investigator. A damn good one." Greg hesitated. "Would that really help?" She arched a brow. "Well, you can always wait for your wife to burst through the door, tearfully confessing her sins. But if you'd rather know the truth now, we need surveillance." Greg exhaled. "All right, do it." As Gina picked up the phone to make arrangements, Greg absently reached for his own device, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then it hit him. Months ago, Marissa had misplaced her phone at a dinner party. In a moment of convenience, Greg had installed a tracker app so they could locate it easily. She had never bothered to delete it. His hands trembled as he pulled up the app, a small, pulsing dot marker location. She wasn't at work. She wasn't anywhere near her office. Greg's breath caught as he zoomed in on the map. She was across town, at a residential address he didn't recognize. He felt his stomach twist. It wasn't an office. It wasn't a cafe. It wasn't even a commercial property. It was a house. "Gina," he said, his voice tight. "I think I just found her." She leaned over the desk, glancing at his phone. A slow, knowing grin spread across her lips. "Looks like we won't have to wait long to see the truth." Greg stared at the screen, his pulse thundering in his ears. Who was waiting for Marissa in that house? And more importantly, what the hell was she doing there? Greg Watson had always believed in protecting his daughters from the harsh realities of the world. He never imagined that one day they would be the ones revealing a brutal truth to him. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. His mind was a swirling storm of betrayal, anger, and disbelief. He had spent the last few hours staring at the private investigator's initial findings, watching blurry photos of his wife in another man's arms. Now, his daughters were coming home. The sound of the front door opening jolted him back to the present. "Dad!" Lisa's voice echoed through the hallway. She and Ginger kicked off their shoes by the door, their backpacks thudding against the floor. Normally, Greg would remind them to be neater, But today, that was the last thing on his mind. He glanced at them, his daughters, his girls. Lisa, 15, with her sharp eyes and quick wit. Ginger, 13, quieter but no less perceptive. They had their mother's features, but Greg liked to think they had his sense of right and wrong. "Hey, Dad," Ginger said, dropping into a chair across from him. "You're home early." Lisa narrowed her eyes. "What's going on?" Greg hesitated. How much could he tell them? "I need you both to pack a bag," he said carefully. "You're going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a few days." Lisa crossed her arms. "Why?" Ginger frowned. "Is something wrong?" Greg opened his mouth, but Lisa spoke before he could. "You found out about Mom, didn't you?" The air in the room thickened. Greg's grip tightened around his coffee mug. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice steady but low. Lisa exchanged a glance with Ginger, who looked away, her face tense. Lisa took a deep breath. "I've heard Mom on the phone." Greg's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "She talks to someone when she thinks we're asleep," Lisa said. "I don't know who, but she sounds different. Like how she talks to clients, except more flirty." Ginger bit her lip. "And she doesn't really care about us anymore," she mumbled. Greg's heart clenched. Lisa continued, her voice quieter now. "She doesn't ask about school. She forgets stuff, important stuff. And sometimes, when we try to talk to her, it's like she's not even listening." Ginger nodded. She used to at least pretend to care. Greg let out a slow breath. His daughters had noticed long before he did. Lisa's eyes flicked to him. "Dad, who is he?" Greg hesitated. He wasn't ready to give them all the details. Not yet. "I don't know everything," he admitted, which was only partly a lie. "But I promise you, I'll find out." Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then she exhaled sharply. "I knew it." Ginger suddenly looked nervous. "Dad, you're not going to leave us, right?" The question shattered him. Greg reached across the table, taking both their hands in his. "Never." A flicker of relief crossed Ginger's face, but Lisa was still tense. Then Greg pulled something from his pocket, a DNA test kit. Lisa stared at it. Her expression darkened. "Is that what I think it is?" Greg swallowed hard. "I just need to be sure." Lisa's jaw tightened. "You don't think we're really yours?" Ginger's eyes went wide. "Dad." Greg held up a hand. "It's not about you, too. I love you no matter what. But after everything," he trailed off, the words too painful to say aloud. Lisa looked away, her face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she snatched the test from his hand and pulled out a swab. "Fine," she muttered. "Let's do this." Ginger hesitated, then took hers too. Greg watched as they each ran the swabs along the insides of their cheeks, sealing them in the provided envelopes. A lump formed in his throat. If these results came back wrong, it wouldn't change how he felt about his daughters. But it would change everything else. As they handed him the sealed swabs, Lisa met his gaze, her voice softer this time. "Dad." "Yeah. We're going to be okay, right?" Greg forced a smile, even as his world teetered on the edge of collapse. "Yeah, sweetheart," he whispered. "We'll be okay." Even if he didn't know how yet. The night was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of Greg's fingers against his kitchen counter. He had barely eaten, barely slept. The past few days had been a whirlwind of revelations, each one hitting him harder than the last. But tonight, the truth would be undeniable. His phone vibrated. A message from Clayton Investigations. "We have confirmation. Meet us in 20 minutes. 1812, Redford Lane." Greg's breath hitched. He knew that address. It wasn't a hotel or some obscure meeting spot. It was a house. A house on the north side of town, where Marissa's GPS had pinged twice in the last week. He grabbed his keys, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The investigator, Marcus Clayton, was already waiting when Greg pulled up a block away. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, dressed in a dark jacket that blended into the shadows. His SUV was parked inconspicuously across the street, camera equipment set up on the dashboard. Greg climbed into the passenger seat. His pulse quickened as Marcus wordlessly handed him a tablet. What he saw made his stomach churn. Marissa. She was in the driveway of the house, laughing, laughing, as she leaned into the arms of another man. Jake Reynolds. The same Jake Reynolds who had promoted her at work. The same Jake Reynolds who had mentored her in real estate. The same Jake Reynolds who had taken business trips to Chicago at the same time she had. Marissa's arms snaked around his neck, and Jake kissed her. Deeply, passionately. Greg's grip on the tablet tightened until his knuckles turned white. You sure you want to keep watching? Marcus asked. His voice was even, but Greg could sense the caution in it. Greg forced himself to nod. I need to see everything. The footage was crystal clear, shot from a long-range lens that captured every movement, every whispered conversation. They weren't just sneaking around in the dark. They were comfortable here. Like it was routine. Like it was home. The next clip showed them stepping inside. A hidden camera near the front window caught Marissa stripping off her blazer, tossing it onto the couch like she lived there. Jake disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 glasses of wine. You recognize this place? Marcus asked. Greg exhaled sharply. Yeah, I looked up the address on the county registry before I came here. It's owned by Jake's company, probably bought under a shell corporation. He's been keeping it off the books. Marcus nodded approvingly. Smart. Makes it harder for people to track, but not impossible. Greg stared at the screen, watching his wife, the mother of his children, laugh and drink and kiss another man in a house that was clearly meant for them. He felt sick. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, he asked, What do you want to do with this? Greg's jaw clenched. Send it all to my lawyer. The next morning, Gina Hawkins' office felt colder than usual. The blinds were drawn, the only light coming from a desk lamp that cast sharp shadows across the walls. Greg sat across from her, hands clasped so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. She tapped her pen against a folder. This is more than enough, Greg. You have her dead to rights. The video evidence, the bank records, the phone tracker logs, it's a slam dunk case for adultery. Greg's voice was tight. What does that mean for the divorce? Best case scenario, you get full custody, she gets limited visitation, and she walks away with less than she ever imagined. Greg let that sink in. She deserves worse. Gina sighed. I know how you feel, but the courts don't deal in revenge, Greg. They deal in facts. And right now, the facts are very much in your favor. Greg leaned forward, his eyes burning with something deeper than anger. What about Jake? Gina tilted her head. What about him? He's her boss. If their company has a morality clause in their contracts. Gina smiled. A slow, knowing smile. I'll look into it. Greg nodded, gripping the arms of his chair. The pieces were falling into place. Marissa had played him for a fool. She had risked his health, his dignity, his family, all for a sleazy office affair. But she had underestimated him. And now, he was going to take everything from her. Greg Watson sat in his dimly lit living room, the only sound in the house the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the fireplace. In front of him, on the coffee table, lay the evidence, photos, financial records, even a copy of his STD test. Proof of betrayal. Proof that the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, had shattered their marriage in ways he could never have imagined. His fingers drummed against the armrest of the couch. His daughters were staying at his parents' house for the night, giving him the space he needed to do what had to be done. The weight was suffocating. His phone buzzed. Marissa, be home in 10. Love you. Greg scoffed, the words so empty now they might as well be poison. Love. Was that what she called it? What kind of love drove a wife into the arms of another man for 2 years? What kind of love left her husband infected with another man's disease? The sound of the garage door rumbling open made his pulse quicken. His breath slowed as he steeled himself. The front door opened, and Marissa walked in, tossing her purse onto the counter like any other night. She hadn't even noticed the stack of damning evidence in plain view. She turned to him with her usual faux cheerful tone. Hey, babe, you're home early. Greg stayed silent. The weight of his stare must have unsettled her because she hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. What's wrong? She asked. A slow exhale left Greg's lips. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and pointed to the table. Take a look. She glanced down, confusion flickering across her face. Then, as her eyes scanned the photographs, asterisk her and Jake Reynolds of the Northside house, their lips pressed together, her hands tangled in his suit jacket, her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next image, her walking inside the house in broad daylight, looking over her shoulder, unaware that she was being watched. Then the next, a bank statement showing transfers from Jake's personal account into her secret one. She swallowed hard. Greg, I don't. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. How long? Marissa's lip quivered, and for a brief second, Greg saw something unfamiliar in her eyes, fear. Greg, please, let's just talk about this. He slammed his palm onto the table. I said, how long? She flinched. Silence stretched between them like a taut rope about to snap. Finally, she exhaled shakily. 2 years. Greg's head dropped slightly, his eyes closing. He had expected it, but hearing the words still felt like a knife to the gut. 2 years. 24 months of deceit. His voice was eerily calm. Did you ever plan on telling me? Marissa shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. I never wanted to hurt you. Greg let out a hollow laugh. You never wanted to hurt me? He grabbed the test results and held them up. Then why the hell do I have this? She looked at the paper, her lips parting slightly as realization dawned. Greg's voice was low, but his fury burned beneath it. Do you know how I found out? Not because you had the decency to confess. Not because I caught you sneaking out of her bed. I found out because I got an STD, Marissa. He threw the paper at her feet. A disease that I could have passed on to you, that could have affected both of us. But I guess you already knew about that, didn't you? Tears streamed down her face now. I swear, I didn't know, Greg. Stop lying. He stood up, towering over her now. You think I don't know where you've been? You think I don't know about the bank account, about all the business trips you were taking? Jake Reynolds. He spat the name like venom. That's who you threw away our marriage for? Marissa's sobs grew louder. It wasn't just like that. I was unhappy, Greg. Greg clenched his jaw. So, your answer was to screw another man for 2 years? That's how you deal with unhappiness. She covered her face with her hands, shaking her head. I made a mistake. Greg laughed bitterly. No, a mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something you don't mean in an argument. This was a choice. Over and over again for 2 years. Marissa looked up at him, her expression shifting. What do you want me to say? That I regret it? That I hate myself? Her voice took on an edge of defiance. Because I do, Greg. I regret it every day. Greg's gaze bore into her. Not enough to stop. Silence. Marissa wiped her face, her shoulders shaking. She looked so small now, but Greg refused to feel sorry for her. I need you to get tested, he said coldly. I don't know if you have it too, but you damn well better find out. She nodded numbly. And then you're going to pack your things. His voice hardened. Because you're leaving. Marissa's face crumpled. Greg, please. No, he stepped back. We're done. She let out a choked sob. What about the girls? Greg exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists. They're staying with me. Her lips parted as if to argue, but then she saw it in his face. The finality, the absolute certainty. There was no fight left to be had. She nodded slowly, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. Okay. Greg watched as she turned toward the bedroom, disappearing inside to pack. The woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted with everything, was now just a stranger he used to love. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but Greg no longer heard it. His house was silent now. But for the first time in a long time, it was peaceful. The finality of the divorce didn't hit Greg all at once. It seeped in slowly, like water through cracked pavement. The papers were signed, the settlement finalized, and Marissa was gone. Physically, legally, emotionally. But the echoes of betrayal still lingered in the quiet moments. His daughters, Lisa and Ginger, had adjusted faster than he expected. Maybe they had seen it coming long before he did. Maybe kids always sense the fractures before they fully split apart. Now, on a crisp Saturday afternoon, Greg sat at the kitchen table with them, textbooks and notebooks spread across the wooden surface. Ginger, his youngest, tapped her pencil against her temple, deep in thought over a math problem. Lisa, more focused, scrawled answers with swift confidence. "All right," Greg said, glancing at Ginger's worksheet. "Let's look at this one again. What's the equation telling us?" Ginger groaned. "That math is stupid." Lisa snorted. "She's been saying that since third grade." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "I think math's just being honest with you. It doesn't lie. Numbers are numbers. Facts are facts." Lisa looked up at him then, her hazel eyes so much like his own. "Kind of like people, huh?" Greg met her gaze, something deep twisting in his chest. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just understanding. "Yeah," he admitted, "kind of like people." For the first time in months, the house didn't feel suffocating. It felt lighter. There were no late-night whispers behind closed doors. No scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to Marissa's clothes. No forced smiles over dinner. Just the three of them. That evening, as Greg washed the dinner dishes, his phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Gina, his attorney. "Jake Reynolds just resigned. Thought you'd like to know." Greg wiped his hands on a dish towel and smirked. Marissa's former boss, the man she had risked everything for, had finally lost something himself. His reputation couldn't survive the scandal, the whispers, the scrutiny. Greg replied with a simple, "Karma." He didn't care about Jake anymore. He didn't even care about Marissa. That chapter was over. Later that night, he stepped onto the back porch with a beer in hand. The sky stretched endlessly above him, the stars sharp and bright in the cold night air. For so long, he had felt trapped in his own life, like a man sleepwalking through a marriage that had already ended long before he realized it. But now there was space. Space to breathe. Space to heal. A gentle creak came from the doorway behind him. He turned to see Lisa standing there, wrapped in a hoodie, her breath visible in the night air. "Can't sleep?" Greg asked. She shook her head and stepped outside, standing next to him. "Just thinking." Greg took a sip of his beer, letting the silence settle between them. "You know," Lisa said softly, "I used to think Mom was this perfect person. Like, she could do no wrong." She allowed a quiet laugh. "But she's just human, and humans mess up." Greg exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, they do." Lisa leaned her head against his shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was little. "I'm glad we have you." Greg swallowed past the lump in his throat. He draped an arm around her, holding her close. "You'll always have me," he promised. And for the first time in a long, long time, Greg Watson knew he wasn't broken anymore. He was whole. He was free. And the future? It was his.